It is particularly special to be here just a few days before my 70th birthday. The night air over London hung thick with mist, and Buckingham Palace stood cloaked in its usual grandeur, majestic, still, and self-contained. Beyond the iron gates, the city slept. The street lamps flickered against the fog, and somewhere beyond the perimeter, the distant echo of a clock struck 5. But inside those centuries-old walls, something subtle had shifted. There was an unease that had no name yet. The royal household followed a rhythm older than any occupant. Footmen rose before dawn. The kitchen stirred with quiet movement, and the royal guard changed shifts with disciplined precision. It was a world ruled by ceremony, secrecy, and silence. Yet, in one corner of the palace, down the private corridor that led to the king's quarters, silence had taken on a strange, almost sentient presence. A senior aide named Geoffrey Turner had served 3 monarchs. He had seen the palace through births, abdications, and funerals. His loyalty was unquestioned, his movements discreet, and his understanding of royal protocol absolute. That morning, he followed his usual path past the portraits of monarchs whose eyes seemed to follow him through the narrow service hall, that only a handful of attendants were allowed to enter. In his hands, a silver tray held the king's morning tea, a single envelope of correspondence, and a folded newspaper from the Times. He stopped before the door of His Majesty's bedroom. It was nearly 5:30, and the king was known for his early rising. Geoffrey knocked softly, then again, no sound. He waited as trained before attempting to open the door, but the handle would not turn. Locked, that was rare, almost unheard of. In all his years of service, the door to the king's room had never been locked in the early hours. Even Queen Elizabeth, Geoffrey remembered, preferred her doors closed, but never barred. It was the unspoken rule of trust within the royal residence. Privacy, yes, but never secrecy. He frowned and knocked again. "Your Majesty," he called, his voice careful, controlled. Still, there was no answer. The corridor seemed to tighten around him. He hesitated, then set the tray down and discreetly pressed the small button concealed within the wooden frame, a signal to the night security team. Within moments, 2 guards appeared, their expressions alert, but restrained, locked. One asked quietly. Geoffrey nodded. Unresponsive, he murmured. Protocol dictated that if the king failed to respond, the private physician should be alerted. Sir Alistair Denham, the royal doctor, for nearly 15 years, arrived minutes later, his expression grim yet calm. He too knocked, calling out the king's name. No answer. Finally, after a brief exchange of formal approvals, the head of security produced the master key. It turned slowly in the lock, the metal grinding against years of disuse until the mechanism released with a faint click. The door opened halfway before catching on something. Geoffrey pushed gently and froze. The king's bedroom, usually immaculate, was in disarray, curtains drawn unevenly, papers scattered across the desk. A faint breeze stirred from an open window carrying the soft rustle of a loose curtain. The bed was made but empty, and on the antique writing table beside a half-finished glass of water lay an object that had not been there the night before. It was a small rectangular, the color of aged oak. Its surface bore faint carvings, hand-etched symbols that no one present could immediately recognize. Wrapped loosely around it was embroidered cloth, the royal crest faded from age. Geoffrey stepped closer, hesitant. The box was closed, but not locked. Sir Alistair looked to the guards. "Stay by the door." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. Geoffrey, trembling slightly, lifted the cloth. Beneath it, he saw a folded piece of paper and an envelope sealed in red wax. It bore the royal cipher For a long moment no one spoke. Sir Alistair reached for the envelope, holding it up to the light. The handwriting was unmistakably graceful, precise, and familiar. It was the late Queen's, but the paper had yellowed, suggesting it was written many years ago, long before her passing. Geoffrey whispered, "It cannot be." The physician turned the envelope over. The wax had never been broken. Beneath cipher in cursive script were words that made his voice falter as he read them aloud. "To be opened by my successor when the hour demands it." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily. The silence in the room deepened. A guard finally spoke. "Where is His Majesty?" They quickly searched the adjoining study, the dressing room, and even the private terrace. Nothing, but within minutes one of footmen returned breathless. "He's in the chapel," the young man said, praying. Relief rippled through the group. Geoffrey bowed his head, but his heart still raced. The chapel, he repeated more to himself than anyone. The king had not prayed at that hour in years, not since the day after his coronation. Sir Alcester turned back to the table, eyes fixed on the envelope. "No one touches this," he instructed, "not until His Majesty gives word." When King Charles returned 20 minutes later, escorted by 2 guards, his face was pale but calm. "There's no cause for alarm," he said quietly. Glancing around the room, his gaze settled on the envelope. For a heartbeat, his expression changed grief, recognition, perhaps even fear. He dismissed the guards and attendants with a gesture. Only Geoffrey and Sir Alcester remained. The king stood before the box, tracing the faded carvings with his fingertips. "This," he murmured, "was my mother's doing." Sir Alcester waited, uncertain whether to respond. The king lifted the envelope, studied it for a moment, and then sighed. "She told me there would come a day when truth would demand its own audience." He turned to Geoffrey. "You may leave." "Geoffrey, thank you." When the door closed, only the king and his physician remained. Charles broke the seal with deliberate care. The faint scent of lavender and aged paper filled the room. He unfolded the letter slowly, his eyes moving across each line with growing stillness. No one else would ever see what was written there, not yet. But Sir Alcester later recalled that the king's expression darkened, not with shock, but with sorrow, the kind that comes from recognition rather than surprise. When he finished reading, the king folded the letter, placed it back into the box, and closed it gently. He rested his hand upon it for a long while before saying, "This must remain unseen until the time is right." Even truth requires its season. The morning sun began to rise over the palace gardens, casting light through the half-drawn curtains. Outside, London awoke, unaware of what had just unfolded behind its most guarded walls. Inside the king's chamber, one truth had reawakened one so carefully hidden that even history had forgotten its existence. For now, the royal household carried on with its rituals, the staff resumed their duties, breakfast was served, the public schedule remained unchanged. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of the monarchy, something unseen had begun to stir, a revelation waiting in silence as it always had. For the moment, destiny would force it into the light. That morning, no announcement was made. The press office received no updates. The world continued its ordinary pace, unaware that a secret centuries in the making had just resurfaced within the private heart of Buckingham Palace. And somewhere deep within that gilded room, under the quiet hum of history itself, the letter of a queen waited once more for the hour she had foretold. The hidden letter. The next morning, unfolded with the same elegance the public had come to expect from Buckingham Palace, the gates opened for the early staff. The royal standard fluttered above the rooftop, and the scent of polished wood and fresh roses filled the corridors. Yet behind the quiet precision of royal order, a subdued tension lingered. The king's aides, though careful to appear composed, moved with unusual restraint. Every word spoken between them was low and measured, as though the air itself was listening. Within the king's private quarters, the wooden box sat upon the desk where he had left it. The room had been tidied, yet the faint sense of weight remained, as if the letter carried its own atmosphere. When the king entered shortly after sunrise, accompanied only by his personal secretary and physician, the mood shifted. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, though his bearing remained dignified. "Your Majesty," Sir Alcester began softly, "would you like the morning briefings delayed?" Charles shook his head. "No, the country will not wait because I have read a letter." He approached the box again, running a hand over its carvings. "But what it says must be understood and handled with care." The secretary, cautious but curious, asked what no one else dared. Was it truly from Her Majesty? The king nodded slowly without question. "Her hand, her seal, her scent. I remember it." He paused, his gaze distant, but the contents, they were not written for the public eye. He lifted the letter once more, unfolding it deliberately. The paper crackled softly. His voice, when he read aloud, was low, almost reverent. "To my successor," it began, "when this reaches you, you will carry the burden I have long kept hidden. Beneath the weight of the crown lies a truth older than any throne. You must decide when to face it and how to bear it." He stopped reading there, lowering the page with a sigh. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. "She wrote this not long after her coronation," he murmured, meaning she knew something I did not, something even my father never spoke of. The physician leaned forward slightly. "Do you believe it concerns the line of succession?" The king considered, then shook his head. "Not precisely. She wrote of a sealed place and of a vow between monarchs." The tone was not confessional. It was instructional, as though she expected me to find something. For a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then with quiet authority he said, "Summon the archivist." Within an hour, the palace archivist Margaret Weller arrived, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a historian's discipline. She had served both the late queen and now the king, her loyalty proven across decades. When the king handed her the letter, she handled it like a relic. "I have seen this seal before," she whispered. "It was used only for internal sovereign correspondence and private exchanges between reigning monarchs. No one outside the line ever sees them." Charles listened intently. "And where would such correspondence be kept?" "In the old West Wing archives, Your Majesty," she replied, "the section predating the Second World War. Some of it remained sealed under royal directive." The king's gaze deepened. "Then that is where we shall go." The palace was vast, a labyrinth of history layered upon itself. Beneath the splendor of its public rooms lay corridors untouched for generations, doors that had not opened since the days of George Roman III. The West Wing was one such place. When the king, accompanied by the archivist and 2 security officers, descended the narrow stairway leading toward the restricted vaults, the air turned cooler. The sound of their footsteps echoed faintly against the stone floors. Margaret carried a lantern and a ring of iron keys that jingled softly. These passages were part of the original house. She said when Buckingham was expanded, much of this was sealed away, preserved as heritage. Some say even the early Windsor avoided coming down here. They reached a heavy iron door engraved with the initials GR. Beneath the dust, a line of words was etched into the metal. "What is sealed beneath the crown remains within its trust." The king stood before it silent. She mentioned a chamber. He said, "Could this be it?" The archivist inserted one of the keys. The lock turned with a groan. The door opened inward, revealing a small chamber dimly lit by their lantern. Inside were cedar-lined shelves filled with ledgers, portraits, and boxes of objects long forgotten. At the center sat a single chest draped with a faded Union flag. Charles stepped closer. This was what she meant, he whispered. He removed the flag, folded it neatly, and opened the chest. Inside were letters, maps, and a collection of personal documents belonging to the monarch's past. But what drew his attention was a small silver-framed mirror resting atop the pile. Its inscription read, "The crown sees all." The king lifted it carefully. For a moment, his reflection flickered in the glass, distorted, uncertain. He set it aside and began to examine the papers beneath. They were written in the careful script of the early 20th century, signed by the first monarch of the House of Windsor. The words spoke of a pact of discretion, an agreement made to conceal a truth concerning the crown's origins, something that, if revealed, could destabilize faith in the lineage. The king closed the chest quietly. "It seems," he said in a low voice, "that the monarchy has been guarding more than just tradition." Margaret looked at him solemnly. "Shall I record this in the official archive, Your Majesty?" He shook his head. "Not yet. Let history rest a little longer. When its moment comes, the world will hear it from me, not from rumor." As they ascended the narrow stairs once more, the king's mind lingered on his mother's words. The truth she had foreseen had found him, but its timing, its meaning, and its cost were yet to be revealed. By the time they reached the main corridors again, the palace had returned to its familiar hum. Servants hurried with trays and linens, and distant laughter drifted from the kitchens. To the outside world, the monarchy remained as polished as ever. Yet beneath its surface, the king now carried a letter that could rewrite what Britain thought it knew about its crown, its legacy, and the silent weight of its truth. The chamber below. Rain fell over London that afternoon, soft and unrelenting, painting the city in silver hues. From the palace windows, the king watched the clouds settle low over the gardens. It was the kind of rain that seemed to silence everything, streets, voices, even thought. Yet in that stillness, his mind was anything but quiet. The words from his mother's letter echoed through him like an ancient bell. Beneath the weight of the crown lies a truth older than any throne. He turned toward the wooden box resting on the table. Its carvings seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, symbols of vines and crowns intertwined. He could almost hear her voice as he traced them to her calm authority, her unshakable restraint. The queen had carried her secret to the grave. Now it was his to confront. By evening, he made a decision. Whatever the sealed place referred to, it was time to uncover it. He summoned Margaret Weller, the palace archivist, along with 2 trusted security officers and the master of works, a graying man who had spent 30 years maintaining the labyrinth beneath the royal estate. Their instructions were brief but precise. They were to follow the records indicated in the documents found earlier that day. The descent began near the West Wing, through a service passage few remembered existed. The walls narrowed as they went, the polished marble giving way to raw stone. Old oil lamps lined the corridors, relics of a pre-electric era. Their footsteps echoed, joined only by the sound of dripping water from somewhere unseen. The last map mentioned a secondary foundation beneath this section. Margaret explained, lantern in hand. It predates the modern structure built during the reign of George Roman III. Some of these tunnels may lead back to the original Buckingham House. The king said little, his expression fixed in quiet determination. When they reached the lower landing, the air grew colder, the smell of age thick in the stone. A door awaited them at the end of the passage, iron-bound, with hinges so rusted they appeared fused. The master of works examined it carefully. "This door has not been opened in centuries," he murmured, "but the design is unmistakable royal craftsmanship, 18th century. And here, see these initials." The king leaned closer. Etched above the handle were the letters GR, the mark of George Rex. Beneath it, nearly faded to invisibility, was a phrase carved into the metal. "What is kept in silence remains in power. Charles stepped forward, resting his hand upon the door. Then we break the silence. With effort, the lock gave way. The door opened with a long, resonant groan that seemed to awaken something ancient in the air. The chamber beyond was small, no larger than a chapel, but the atmosphere was thick with reverence. The scent of cedar and dust filled the air. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each bearing relics, bound ledgers, wax-sealed boxes, tarnished portraits, and a scattering of candles untouched by time. In the center stood a cedar chest draped in a faded Union flag. The king approached it slowly, as though stepping into the memory of every monarch who had stood where he now stood. He lifted the flag with care, folding it neatly, revealing an emblem carved into the lid of a crown within a circle of stars. Margaret whispered, "That is not a British symbol. It resembles the heraldry of an earlier royal house." Charles knelt beside the chest and pressed against its latch. It opened easily as though expecting him. Inside lay layers of parchment and vellum scrolls, each sealed with wax. On the topmost layer rested a silver-framed mirror, small enough to hold in both hands. The inscription along its rim read, "The crown sees all." He lifted it slowly, his reflection faint in the dim light. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw another face overlapping his own, a shadow of an ancestor, perhaps, or simply the trick of a wavering flame. He set it aside and began to examine the documents beneath. Margaret lit 2 more lamps to illuminate the room. The handwriting on the scrolls was careful, deliberate, and written in the style of the early 20th century. "These are signatures of George V," she observed, "and here Edward, Prince of Wales. They're dated 1916. The king unfolded the first document. The words within were formal, almost ceremonial. It spoke of a pact of discretion between monarchs of Britain and a continental ally, designed to protect a shared lineage in a time when national identities demand division. The language was coded, its meaning veiled, but the intent was unmistakable. This was written during the Great War, Margaret said softly. The House of Windsor was created then, replacing the old German names Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha. This may have been their private arrangement and understanding to conceal deeper familial connections. The king read further, his face hardening. The document referenced bloodlines intertwined across the channel, and an oath of silence sworn to preserve the image of separation for the sake of the British throne. There was even mention of an heir preserved through secrecy, a phrase so ambiguous it could mean almost anything. He placed the papers back into the chest, his hand trembling slightly. This, he said finally, was the burden she spoke of. Margaret looked at him hesitant. If this came to light, it would change how the monarchy is perceived. "But it does not alter who you are, Your Majesty." He gave a faint, weary smile, perhaps not in law, but perhaps in legacy. "We are heirs not just to crowns, but to choices, and some choices," he added quietly, "linger longer than any reign." For a few moments none of them spoke. The sound of the rain above seemed to seep through the stone, soft and rhythmic. Then the king closed the chest, covering it once again with the folded flag. "Seal this place," he ordered. "No one enters without my consent." As they made their way back through the passage, Margaret looked back one last time. The chamber seemed to breathe in the lantern light, its secrets momentarily disturbed after centuries of slumber. When they emerged into the upper halls, the contrast was jarring. The warm glow of chandeliers, the faint hum of voices, the quiet glide of servants preparing for supper. The king paused at the threshold, brushing dust from his hands. "Your Majesty," Margaret said softly, "what will you do now?" He turned to her, his eyes distant. I will think and I will pray. The truth is never the enemy, but timing decides its mercy. That night, as the palace lights dimmed and London settled under its reign, the king returned to his private quarters. The wooden box still sat on his desk, the queen's letter folded neatly inside. He looked at it for a long time, the faint reflection of candle light dancing across its surface. Then he whispered almost to himself, "You knew, mother. You always knew." Somewhere below, behind iron doors and cedar walls, the chamber waited once more in silence, its revelation now in the hands of a monarch who carried not only the weight of history, but the haunting awareness of how fragile truth could be when guarded by a crown. The leak, for 3 days, the palace remained eerily composed, as if the discovery beneath its floors had never occurred. Every morning unfolded with familiar ceremony, guards at their posts, carriages arriving, aides bowing with practiced grace. Yet under that surface calm, a quiet anxiety pulsed through every corridor. Those few who knew of the chamber moved with measured caution, exchanging restrained glances, but no words. It was a secret too heavy to discuss and too dangerous to conceal forever. But secrets, even royal ones, rarely stay silent for long. It began with a whisper from within the palace kitchens. A junior attendant overheard a fragment of conversation, something about a room beneath the throne wing and the king himself descending. Within hours, that whisper slipped into the servants' quarters, and by evening it had reached a distant cousin of one of the household staff, who happened to work as a freelance journalist. By the following morning, a headline appeared discreetly on a minor London news site: "Mystery movement inside Buckingham Palace." Midnight activity sparks speculation. At first, the palace ignored it. Such rumors were not unusual. For generations, the crown had lived under the constant gaze of curiosity and conjecture. But this time, the silence only deepened the intrigue. The king was at Windsor when the press office informed him. He stood by the window overlooking the mist rolling across the lawns, his expression unreadable. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly, contained for now. Replied the communications secretary. "The major networks have not picked it up yet, but the online reports are gathering traction." Charles nodded slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "And who leaked it?" "We cannot be sure, Your Majesty. There was an internal breach, but it's possible the information was pieced together from partial accounts." Servants talk, security logs were accessed. The king turned away from the window. "Then we will not chase whispers," he said firmly. "We will maintain composure. The truth, whatever form it takes, must never appear defensive." Meanwhile, in London, the press office worked tirelessly to manage the storm. A carefully worded statement was released. There has been no incident of significance within Buckingham Palace. Reports suggesting discoveries of a historical nature are unfounded, but the phrasing measured, deliberate and slightly formal did not convince anyone. Denials without conviction often carry the scent of truth. Soon after, a grainy photograph appeared online. It showed what seemed to be two men in suits carrying a small wooden box into an armored vehicle outside a rear gate of the palace. The image was blurred yet unmistakably authentic. The caption reads simply, "Evidence removed." Within hours, media vans began gathering near the gates. Commentators filled the airwaves with speculation. Analysts dissected the photograph, and historians debated the plausibility of a hidden royal vault. The palace's centuries-old facade of privacy began to tremble beneath the weight of modern scrutiny. Behind closed doors, the king convened a meeting in the Crimson Drawing Room at Windsor. Present were his closest advisors, his private secretary, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The atmosphere was tense but respectful. The king listened as options were presented: containment, diversion, and silence. Then, after a long pause, he said, "The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, and scandals, not because it is flawless, but because it endures. We will not respond with panic. We will respond with integrity." The archbishop inclined his head. "And what of the letter, Your Majesty? Does it still remain in your possession?" Charles looked toward the fireplace. "It does," he said quietly, "and it will remain so until I decide otherwise." That evening, he returned to Buckingham Palace under discreet escort. The streets outside the gates were crowded with photographers, their lenses glinting beneath the lamplight. From within his car, he could see flashes of light erupting like silent lightning. The monarchy had always lived in the public eye, but never had the gaze felt so piercing, so insistent. Inside the palace, he dismissed his aides and entered his private study alone. The wooden box lay once more upon his desk, unchanged, untouched. He rested his hand upon it, feeling its cool surface beneath his palm. The letter carried no malice, only foresight. Yet foresight, he realized, could be as burdensome as prophecy. He opened the curtain slightly, gazing out at the courtyard below. He thought of his mother, her voice calm, her decisions measured. She had known the cost of secrets and the discipline required to keep them. Now the same weight rested upon him, but the world around him was not the same. What she had kept in silence, he might one day be forced to speak aloud. The next morning, the tabloids exploded with coverage. Theories flooded every headline that the king had found forbidden documents, that he was guarding evidence of a scandal, that the monarchy was concealing its true ancestry. None of it was verified, yet the sheer volume of speculation made it feel undeniable. Still, the king refused to issue a further statement. His composure became his message. When asked by a close aide whether he wished to call for an investigation into the leak, he simply replied, "No. Let truth find its way through time. It always does." By week's end, public fascination had reached fever pitch. Journalists camped outside the palace. Drone cameras hovered near the gardens, and even members of parliament quietly inquired whether the matter of historical record might soon warrant explanation. The institution had faced storms before, but this was a modern tempest driven by curiosity, not rebellion. And through it all, the king remained steady. He attended scheduled events, shook hands, smiled, and spoke of duty and continuity. Yet each night when he returned to his chamber, his eyes fell once more upon that letter, the quiet pulse of a truth the world was now circling. Unaware of how close it stood to history's deepest secret, it was then that he understood the wisdom behind his mother's words. Silence was not always secrecy. Sometimes it was protection, and until the right hour arrived, the crown itself would have to remain the guardian of both truth and restraint. The revelation, 2 weeks after the leak, the storm that had engulfed the palace had neither faded nor peaked. It had simply grown quieter, more controlled, and more dangerous. Journalists now spoke in careful tones, citing sources close to the royal household. Politicians avoided direct comment, and historians filled the airwaves with speculation, each one sensing that something monumental hovered just out of reach. The palace gates, which had withstood centuries of scrutiny, now seemed to guard not just royalty, but revelation. Within those walls, the king had made his decision. He would not allow gossip to define what truth demanded. If history were to speak, it would do so under the discipline of dignity. Quietly, without public announcement, he summoned a small group to Windsor Castle. 4 historians, 2 church representatives, the royal archivist, and his private secretary. No press, no cameras, no aides beyond that circle. Only witnesses chosen not for loyalty, but for discernment. The meeting took place in the long gallery where portraits of monarchs watched from every wall. The afternoon light filtered through tall arched windows, painting the room in muted gold. The king stood before them, a simple folder in his hands, the wooden box resting on a table beside him. There was no ceremony, no trumpets, only the steady hum of rain against the glass. "My mother left me a letter," he began. It was not meant for the public. It was meant for the one who would come after her. Yet its contents concern not one monarch, but every monarch who has worn this crown. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then he unfolded the letter, reading aloud with deliberate calm. Her handwriting, poised and unwavering, filled the room in his voice. "When you read this, you will understand that the monarchy you inherit is not merely of blood, but of choice. What has been concealed was not to deceive, but to protect what unity demanded." The king lowered the page. "Beneath Buckingham Palace, there lies a sealed chamber," he continued. "Within it are records from the early years of the 20th century. Those records speak of a pact between the first monarch of the House of Windsor and his continental relatives. It was forged in a time of war when the survival of this institution required the illusion of separation." He gestured toward the wooden box. "The documents confirmed that our lineage extended farther than the world believed. The change of name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor was not only symbolic, it was strategic. But beyond that, it concealed ties, familial, financial, and political ties that could not withstand the climate of that age." The room was still, no one spoke. Margaret Weller, the archivist, finally asked, "Does this alter the legitimacy of the throne, Your Majesty?" The king's eyes met hers. "No, the throne is built not on purity of blood, but on continuity of duty. Yet what was hidden shaped how that duty was carried forward. It made monarchs guardians of illusion, not truth." The archbishop leaned forward. "And you would have this truth recorded." "I would." The king said, "But not broadcast, not exploited, preserved with context, with understanding. History must not be weaponized, but it must never again be buried." He opened the box and withdrew several folded documents, the pact itself, the correspondence between monarchs, and the silver mirror found in the chamber below. He placed the mirror upon the table, its surface dull in the muted light. "This," he said softly, "was found with the papers. It bears the inscription, 'The crown sees all.' My mother once told me that every heir inherits not just authority, but memory. I think now I understand what she meant. For a time no one moved. The weight of centuries hung in the air like a suspended breath. When the historians finally spoke, it was with cautious reverence. They agreed to document everything under a sealed record, to be archived under royal warrant, accessible only upon the monarch's command or by parliamentary order. The truth would live not as scandal, but as history waiting for its appointed hour." That night, long after the scholars had departed, the king walked alone through the corridors of Windsor. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, filled with the scent of wet stone and candle wax. He paused at a window overlooking the grounds, where the lamps glowed faintly across the darkness. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders seemed lighter. He had not escaped the burden. He had merely shared it with time itself. Later, in his private chamber, he unsealed one final document from the collection. It was a letter not addressed to him but to the future. Written in the delicate hand of his grandmother, it reads simply, "To those who reign after me, remember truth does not destroy the crown. It purifies it." He folded it gently and placed it beside his mother's letter. Then, in the quiet of that midnight hour, he whispered, "So be it." In the days that followed, the palace released a measured statement, It confirmed that archival materials of historical significance had been reviewed by His Majesty and a team of scholars, and that they pertained to early 20th century records concerning the evolution of the royal household. The phrasing was precise, factual, and restrained. No sensationalism, no denial, just acknowledgement. The effect was immediate and unexpected. The frenzy that had once surrounded the rumors began to calm. The public, rather than turning scandalous, seemed almost contemplative. Commentators praised the king's poise. Editorials spoke of a sovereign willing to face the past with grace. In the space of days, the monarchy had transformed a potential crisis into a demonstration of restraint and wisdom. Still, not everything was said. Deep within the palace archives, the sealed chest remained, its contents catalogued but unreleased. The mirror, the letters, the pact, all preserved, awaiting an age that could bear them without division. The king had not exorcised history's ghosts, he had merely given them peace. On a quiet evening, not long after, he returned to Buckingham Palace. Passing through the grand hallway, he paused before a portrait of his mother. Her eyes, calm and knowing, seemed to follow him. "You foresaw this," he murmured. "You left me both the burden and the map." Then he smiled faintly, and perhaps that was love. As the palace clock struck 10, he entered his room, the same room where it had begun. The wooden box still rested on his desk, the letters inside. Outside, London glittered under the night sky, unaware that its oldest institution had at last looked into its own reflection and chosen honesty over myth. The truth sealed once in darkness had finally seen light, not as scandal, but as revelation, and in that revelation, the monarchy found not its downfall, but its quiet redemption. History whispers where crowns are worn. Behind grandeur lies humanity, flawed, burdened, enduring. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold royal revelations, mysteries behind palace doors, and the truths that time tried to bury. Because every crown carries a secret, and every secret waits to be revealed. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more. See you next time.